Today we're going to be tier listing animated movie soundtracks, with a couple extra rules to make sure I don't go way overboard with too long of a list. For a start, typically we're going to be sticking to 3D animated movies, as there are far too many 2D ones to add to this list, and the channel in general is relatively centralized on the 3D stuff, though there may be the occasional quick honorable mention. And also the other main one is what I mean by soundtrack isn't necessarily musicals. We're not doing a tier list of musical movies, although some of these movies, yeah, will have actual songs with lyrics in them. What I mean by soundtrack really is score. The instrumental stuff is my personal taste in music. I love that stuff. I'd inject it directly into my veins if I could, and generally, you can probably tell that already, I regularly play instrumental music in the background of my videos. I'm sure there's one playing right now, and that is very much my taste in music. I don't know if it's because when lyrics are happening, my mind just disappears into another realm and I get distracted, or just instrumental stuff has more emotional chords because you can take it in any direction. I don't know. Either way, when it comes to animated movies, sometimes a soundtrack could really make or break it, eternalizing something from great to legendary. Whether it's a kind of comfort film that makes you feel actually engulfed in a wonderful tone, or just genuine artistry that only pushes against the boundaries of the medium. So with that in mind, at the very bottom of our list is a kind of category of soundtracks in movies, that being the Jukebox musical. This is your DreamWorks Trolls and your Illumination Sing. They may have the occasional flares in there to remix it into their own image and adding a celebrity cast doing the lyrics, but typically to me, this is a soundtrack being cheap. It's an easy crowd pleaser because you're standing on the accolades of somebody else. And then when it comes to the actual score of the rest of the movie, it's practically forgettable because of how much it's overshadowed by the main stuff and not at all the priority. Perhaps we're immediately starting on a hot take to say I hate mainstream music. No, that actually sounds pretty on brand for a animated movie reviewer that looks like this. But even still, these are the kind of soundtracks I actively dislike because I just don't think it's earned in the same way. And would be much more fulfilled to hear, if we have to go with the lyrical musical sense, original songs baked into how the character arcs are going, as is usually the norm anyway. So moving on a little bit up from that, we then have a little bit more of Illumination. It is the Mario movie. Now this one, hey, not a lyrical musical, and that's good, but it is faintly similar into being a jukebox musical, but to the point I'd actually say, hey, I enjoy this. There's only really one point that's negative in this whole list, I'll be honest. The rest of this is all top tier stuff, really. Now you see, with the Mario movie, it is all instrumental soundtrack for the most part. I mean, there's the occasional pop cultural 80s song in there, sure, whatever, ignore. But at least what is nice here is this is adaptating referential content based off of the source material, and considering video game music is exactly my taste in music, to get a new rendition a little bit more orchestral is absolutely great, and jingly keys in a good kind of way. Maybe this is immediately like contradicting the last point, but hey, I like it better when it's instrumental, I guess. Yeah, the accolades that they're standing on the shoulders of is still themselves, so it's different. Now, admittedly, I think I prefer, of course, the original video game soundtracks than the overly orchestral thing. It's kind of like when a video game gets a remake, and then they remake the soundtrack, and the soundtrack's worse because it's more polished and rounded and, I don't want to say normie, but you know, it loses the intricate details of the MIDI file that it came from. But here, yeah, I think this is pretty solid and passable. This is the kind of dopamine hit of, I get that, I understand all of these tiny references that the little children don't catch as often as I do because I'm making these life choices. It's satisfying in a ear candy kind of way rather than eye candy. And a soundtrack that leaves you auditorially satisfied is a pretty damn good soundtrack. But getting more original just means you can get all the more higher. Enter next on our list, maybe a weird one, I don't know. It is Pixar's Monsters, Inc. So, this is the real crux of where this video prompt came from, as there's something about classic Pixar soundtracks that just ooze that childhood warmth and nostalgia. Now, of course, the main Monsters, Inc. soundtrack that's obviously the one that popped off is the intro theme with the doors that then became a meme of itself. Very goofy. I don't know what on earth they're doing with that brass instrument. But even when listening to just the rest of it, there's this unique sense of wonder to it. It's again a lot of string instruments and a lot of orchestra, but in a way that has the world opening up to you, all the while having this jazzy brass element added throughout to really mostly make the monster world less scary, but it has this wonderful thematic tone of, wow, look at this wonderful world we've created that's a little bit, whoa, a little bit odd, a little bit cool. Clearly not me. I think it maybe comes from the fact that this is one of Pixar's first in doing that entire theme, which is most of their movies, of, whoa, look at this open world. But I think it really strikes at that sort of childhood whimsy of not really knowing the world around you and being optimistic for where it could expand from there, in a ways that modern movies don't do anymore because we've heard that kind of theme too many times before, or the world's gotten darker. I don't know. But Monsters Inc., I think, has such a unique sound font against so many other movies because it's just a little bit unblazoned in places. Something about it is just eternally comforting and safe whilst being big and proud and fun along the way. And I think this is just simply a recurring thing in especially early Pixar works that I don't quite feel in the later stuff. We will be getting into some of the later Pixar projects in this very tier list, so I guess we'll dive into it a little bit more there. But I feel like the highlights from Pixar soundtracks lean towards the classic stuff as they do the more obvious directions rather than having to get more niche and specific, like say Soul, where they have a whole ethereal tone to play with and then some jazz, because doing the wow, what a wonderful world has been done many times before, even just inside that same studio alone. But for Monsters Inc., being one of the earliest Pixar stuff, they absolutely run with it. And you know what, screw it, since we otherwise don't want to go through every single Pixar movie, I'd say we can clump a good chunk of the early stuff in here as well that have a similar kind of tone of, wow, look at the world, without an extra level of praise on top of it that I'll give with specific Pixar movies later. So this could also be the likes of Ratatouille with the same kind of idea of whimsy and look at the world, because you're a small rat in France, with of course that French thematic sound font on there as well. Anyway, moving on up in the list, we then have the next kind of category I would go on to say, which is a soundtrack that might not be so memorable in every individual song number, but in one big song introduction, that perfect earworm that really, really sinks into your long-term memory. And in the case for this one, we're talking about Ice Age. The rest of the score, you know, it's alright. There's a lot of nice wind instruments in there to get that wintry vibe going on, and very much fits, you know, the usual sound font you'd expect for that kind of tribal, caveman-esque era. There's a lot of drums as well that I'm hearing. But no, the thing that really stands out is, of course, the opening main number with the march at the start of the movie. This, I think in its own right, could very well be a category of soundtracks as far as I'm concerned. Although I said we're only doing 3D, it's around this area that we'd also put in Lilo and Stitch. Again, having its own nice enough soundtrack, but you know it for that one main song, that big moment that doesn't just feel like they grabbed the latest, most relevant song number of the time either. They chose an external song choice, but then used one that's not upfront the most popular example, Illumination, and instead just goes on an approach that really works in the context of the project, and then practically becomes emblematic of that project. I think we're going to quickly find there is a notable general shift into that childhood nostalgia, and hey, I guess that makes sense, it's my list anyway, and I feel like it's the kind of thing I don't feel like with recent movies, even beyond the nostalgia front. I feel like movies these days get a little bit more samey as we've found the format that works best, so when you go back to these early 2000s eras with the original Ice Age, it just feels so much more unique and investing because of how it's kind of new territory at the time. Or at least that's my kind of vague 2 cents on it. And moving up a little bit more on the list is a same kind of category for, hey, actually a 3D movie again. It's DreamWorks' Over the Hedge next, having much of those same elements, except also multiple songs, absolutely iconic. The actual sound font of the normal score of Over the Hedge, it's kind of the more standard, generic kind of animated movie we get. It's a lot of just general orchestra, a lot of violins, following the beats of the motions of the characters. It kind of gets a little bit, you know, lost in the diluted form of every movie sounds like this in the back end. Sounds nice, sounds faintly dreamy, thematic, not fast. Where Over the Hedge really shines is in their pop cultural choice number externally in the form of Ben Folds. And what's especially nice with this one as well is this is a very political song number, or at least the main upfront one. The whole rocking in the suburbs thing is a brilliant thematic piece for the idea of, you know, combating against American suburbia and showcasing it with that naturalistic lens. But then you realize there's an uncensored version as well that only digs in more. Not to mention there's the extended edition of a guy full on just monologuing and shouting in the middle of this song. Like, I really like that this feels like the next step up in this kind of category of it's best known for its external band picks instead. And I think Over the Hedge does an absolutely stellar job with it, and I think Ben Folds is great in this context. Not to mention, it's notably bold for an animated movie, you know, the kind of thing you'd think is made for kids, to have such a strong anti-capitalistic theme that's then baked into the soundtrack as well. Of course, to be fair, it is kind of, you know, at least one layer hidden away. It's just, hey, rocking the suburbs, that sounds great and fun. It's a good way of adapting that message to also just have fun along the way, and I think in that regards, this soundtrack gets all the more accolades above its predecessors that we've mentioned so far today, because it really strives in pushing the boundary of what a soundtrack is aiming to do. Honestly, I'm kind of impressed we've managed to touch on pretty much all the major studios at this point. Illumination, Pixar, Blue Sky, DreamWorks, we've covered them all. I mean, what's next? Are we going to start talking about a Netflix show? Honorable mention, this is where we're going to put in a Netflix show. Technically not a movie, but I kind of like involving this thing where I can. It's kind of relevant in an off-kilter kind of way. Arcane fits in right handily here. And hey, it's actually a more modern animation. Now this, I think, is an example of a soundtrack that goes to a band with the intention of saying, make a song number for us, which I think is a much better way of doing that kind of pop cultural reference song number in there. And I mean, the soundtrack for so much of Arcane is absolutely stellar. This soundtrack does love to go back and forth between score and actual lyrical stuff, but pretty much all of them completely hit the ball out of the park. And it's to the point that it does sometimes feel like the soundtrack of Arcane has ascended the series itself. Maybe it's just because it's Imagine Dragons and they're popular in their own regard. But to say that Arcane isn't an absolutely grand soundtrack would just be lying. And then the rest of the usual score has this interesting remixed theme to it that's of course very fitting to the sort of underground scrappy nature of a lot of the Arcane world. But even still, it's just an animated series, so it technically shouldn't be counted. Let's move on. From one honorable mention to the next, here is Disney's Tangled. Now I said we're not really going to go too deep on the musical numbers, and to be fair, there's not actually that many 3D animated Disney musicals. I thought there were way more of them. But Tangled goes here. Nice standard classic, but for some reason it never quite got that super mainstream push. So I think by pure exposure, I'm just a bit more into the later ones now. I've become part of the crowd. But getting back on track to the score of a mainline movie, we next have Aardman and Wallace and Gromit: Curse of the Were-Rabbit. To be honest, this might just be one big nostalgia fest, but it is a matter of taste, as this soundtrack kind of just has one main song that they motif into every single goddamn soundtrack. But man, it really strikes something in my core. To a T, this movie has that interactive soundtrack, whereby every single motion is practically embellished by the soundtrack, which makes sense for a stop-motion piece. Considering every single frame is given minutes, if not hours of time to perfectly craft, it makes sense that every single note gets that same attention, and Wallace and Gromit in general just represents this entire stop-motion medium since they're practically one of the biggest studios in the game. Here as well, you can put in all the other Aardman productions, to be honest, but Were-Rabbit specifically, I love the additive soundtrack to the usual Wallace and Gromit theme. Something about it all is just so much more unapologetically British. It's the British way of doing an orchestral piece with all of the moving parts, but it doesn't feel exactly like the more general Western American version of animated movies that sometimes get the same kind of sound font and fluff in the background of all their tracks. The soundtrack for this movie as well leans a lot more on the comedic elements of the story, since this is a lot more leaned on the comedy than it is the drama. There is still plenty of drama in Were-Rabbit, sure, but this movie is goofy through and through, and the soundtrack is so unique for really leading into that more in certain places. It almost feels like the people playing the music in this soundtrack are so much more on the ground and with you and the characters with every beat of the movie, rather than being in some metaphorical glass box just playing the sounds in the background. There's something about the soundtrack that's so inviting in Wallace and Gromit movies that makes the whole thing feel so much more humble and close close to you than maybe the likes of the next big Disney hit. And perhaps it's more of a feeling than it is fact, but the soundtrack to Wallace and Gromit Curse of the Were-Rabbit just feels more down to earth, and all the more fitting for the story that it tells, with characters that are meant to be not your classic heroes. I mean, the plotline of this one is about a boring tiny village dealing with a vegetable competition, with a little bit of that heroic twang in there, but in a weird, stupid, silly way. Like how Wallace is a terrible, run-down little van. He ain't no James Bond, you know what I mean? It's just the British way of doing it. And the soundtrack gets all the more brownie points for it. And with that, we've really touched on pretty much every animated studio. All I'm missing now is Warner Brothers. But I'll be honest, Lego Movie and Scoob are not getting into this. Well, I guess Lego Movie does have, you know, the one good pop culture song number in it, but the rest of it, kind of standard. Not noteworthy enough to mention here. I'm nonplussed and this is my list. So moving on up in our list, we're starting to get to the genuinely impressive sound font. Sure, there's still going to be all sorts of opinions and nostalgia bait in there, but the next soundtrack I really want to talk about is DreamWorks' Kung Fu Panda. Because by all means, this movie is such a success, and we need to be talking about it more. To be able to have a Western animation studio telling such a well-done adaptation of Chinese Kung Fu martial arts is incredibly impressive. And the soundtrack absolutely helps in bringing that all together. Though the outcome is relatively simple, I can't imagine the mechanics that went into doing this wonderful blend of the standard Western blend of how an animated movie sounds, alongside authentic Chinese instruments to really bring in the tone and the vibe of the Kung Fu Panda universe. Especially considering this is only like mid to late 2000s. This was the kind of movie and soundtrack that really breaches the boundaries of what 3D animated movies could achieve, and the actual final result is just golden on the ears. So many of the scenes can be just so embellishing to hear. I mean, a lot of the DreamWorks trilogies, to be honest, are kind of overpowered in the audio side of things. But Kung Fu Panda is no exception. Through and through, this is just an exceptional first movie, and the trilogy plus one also sounds pretty good as well. Though I mostly remember the likes of the original movie, the rest is then just extended editions beyond that initial premise. And generally in this list anyway, one soundtrack kind of represents the entire franchise. I doubt they changed the sound font that much from sequel to sequel. That was probably self-explanatory, right? Ah well. Even still, this soundtrack is one of the types that really ticks all the boxes. Not only does it break the boundaries a little bit of what the industry was doing at the time, it does a brilliant adaptation of the thing it is trying to do, but then also at the end of the day, it just sounds brilliant as well. You can enjoy the Kung Fu Panda soundtrack in a bottle by itself. You don't even need the movie to enjoy some parts of Kung Fu Panda. It's just stellar from DreamWorks at the time. Moving on from that, we're then going to do another double bill for Pixar movies that were a little more impressive with their soundtracks, for really being able to sway the audiences into the vibes of some of their soundtracks. The examples for this are of course Pixar's Up and Pixar's WALL-E. When it comes to some of the few times that Pixar covers romance, the soundtrack is so emotive in helping those themes come across. And it's to the point that these songs really have been immortalized by the internet in places for being such masterclasses in taking humans away and sending them to a whole nother world. Whether they end up as eternally blissful after such a slow and steady anticipation, or if it explores the absolute heartbreak of one of the worst case scenarios, these two movies' soundtracks uphold some of the core reasons why Pixar is seen as being so legendary. Though admittedly, say for example the Up soundtrack, beyond that main opening theme, it kind of then goes into the standard. A lot of it is the main motifing, and again, motifing as well pops up a whole lot in WALL-E as well. But that absolutely doesn't shoot down the accolades of the successes these soundtracks have managed to bring, as it gets to a point that they've managed to ascend from the stories they were baked into. You don't even need to have watched these movies to recognize where these soundtracks come from. And I think those examples are absolutely deserved. Moving on to another honorable mention, this is where I would put in El Dorado. But we're not meant to mention the 2D, so this is all our mention of it. Moving on, we have Disney's Encanto. Now, I have a little bit of a controversial take on this movie. I don't like it as much as the average person, I don't think. Even still, I will concede to say the soundtrack is pretty stellar, and most likely that comes to a lot of the exposure. The internet certainly ran with it when it came out in 2021. The score, on the other hand, it's certainly got the sound font for the kind of cultures it's trying to represent, but I think it very much falls into, at least on that front, the more standard animated soundtrack. Wouldn't quite say mush, but kind of. That being said, in regards to ratio of successful main Disney musical song numbers, this movie is definitely up there. And though it might not be as amazingly viral as the original Frozen, but a certain good chunk ahead of Tangled, I think it's a solid shout as the standard musical Disney slot, you know? The song numbers are great and certainly have been played to death in most circles. The score is kinda standard, it's not harmful in any direction, and though I might be slightly less enticed by it than the normal person, I can at least acknowledge that, hey, this is a pretty damn good Disney standard. I mean, it's Lin-Manuel Miranda. They certainly do some more unique things with the standard Disney formula, at least in the songwriting, and that is enjoyable to see. It's just not necessarily my exact favorite example. Continuing on, we have Pixar's Coco, the Pixar equivalent to a Disney musical number, and I think as well, this one is a pretty good standard set. When you compare it to the score, it again has the sound font of the region and cultural representations it's trying to bring, but what really stands out, of course, are the actual mainline lyrical songs, and I will admit, one of my absolute favorite full-on animated musical numbers is in this movie. Namely because the definitive thing that Pixar does that Disney doesn't as well is the full double down deep dive into the emotive sides of this story. No other soundtrack really tries to make you cry as much as Pixar's Coco, and that even manages to bleed further out into just the score. You don't even need to be hearing some of the saddest lyrical line delivery in animated form to get into those feels. With the very sound font simply being a guitar, the score allows itself to really slow down into the occasional slow pluck to dig out some of those emotive tones in the needed scenes, even without all the embellishments of the mainline-ish Disney treatment, which is why I would put it a little bit ahead of Encanto as well, despite otherwise mostly being known for just its one major song choice, maybe two, at a push it's three. But I think overall, especially with the score included as well, Coco is just absolutely fantastic as a soundtrack, and I feel like if I could be nostalgic for this movie, if I grew up with this sound font, I think I too would find this just as comforting and motivating and exhilarating as I do for some of the earlier Pixar stuff. Pixar's Coco is just a brilliant take on the standard Disney formula, and they absolutely nail that category out of the park. Man, that really says something. When I'm trying to look up the Frozen soundtrack, it's practically impossible to actually find the soundtrack. The actual score soundtrack. It's buried by all the lyrical stuff. Frozen goes here. This is what you would think is the best case scenario for a Disney mainline musical. Every one of their song numbers exploded with virality, played endless amount of times that we've all been brainwashed to believe it's good. And hey, maybe I've fallen for the trap. I like these songs as well now. In regards to the score though, it's pretty standard stuff. This movie is the perfect representation of that breakaway between soundtrack and score. Hopefully I'm using those terms correctly, but there's a definitive difference. I like score, and it's for that reason that this movie is so far down on the list. That, and it's cool to be against the grain. And I kind of feel like this movie does go hand in hand with that same kind of category of Encanto and Coco. All three are going for that standard mainline Disney approach, and they each come with different variations of success and non-success, unless that's a spoiler. What is it that makes a soundtrack the best? Is it a ratio of good songs to bad songs? Is it the overall tone and balance of everything being the same good quality? Or is it the actual accomplishments of the core goals of that said soundtrack? Maybe it's okay to have a standard score if you're not pushing for the score to be magnificent. And I think it's kind of for that reason why I have Frozen, Coco, and Encanto kind of switching around in my head. Perhaps they're just the same category, each with their own different points of goals and success. Because on one hand, I initially drafted this as Frozen is the best of the bunch. It clearly breached furthest along and has the most well-regarded songs. But Coco has such a good emotive core in its soundtrack, and the score is good in its own right, and Encanto is kind of a middling ground of the both of them. Slightly less viral, slightly less good score, but overall more balanced. I think it's an interesting case study, and I personally, I guess, would put Coco up top, actually. I like that one the best. This is meant to be a biased opinion. But even still, I'd be interested to hear what other people's takes are on what makes a soundtrack the best soundtrack. And if it's at all different from mine, then this tier list is immediately invalidated and completely different to yours, I bet. That's how most of my tier lists go anyway. Hey there! Thank you for making it to the halfway mark of this video. Come along and subscribe if you're interested in more tier list videos. I do have a long list of prompts I'm going to do, but give us suggestions of your own or tell us your thoughts on movie soundtracks. I'd love to keep the discussion going. It's great to talk about art sometimes. Anyway, no more rambling halfway through. Let's get back to the second half of the rankings of animated movie soundtracks. Don't expect to hear about Mufasa the Lion King. But let's move on from the category of the mainline musical stuff. It's way too mainstream anyway. Again, it's time for another honorable mention. It's Studio Ghibli. With examples like Spirited Away and Nausicaa having that real sense of whimsy, nostalgia, childhood, and endless optimism, it really is a soundtrack that captivates you in the animated form. But it's 2D, so we're not meant to be mentioning it. Big on! And right into another animation studio we haven't mentioned yet. It's the likes of Nightmare Before Christmas and Corpse Bride. A mainline musical number, but with that stop motion effect instead. I think it's the best of both worlds in a lot of ways. I adore the song numbers in these movies, and I think there's more of them of high quality to actually outrank the likes of Frozen, Coco, and Encanto, all the while the soundtrack, being stop motion infused, again has that humble to the ground interactive piece that I think just makes every single frame a piece of art. And though it might not have exactly the same sense of virality, you certainly know these song numbers. It's to the point that I actually saw these movies quite late in life, and when I finally did see, for example, Nightmare Before Christmas, I came to find out that I'd accidentally been listening to fan-made covers of this song, completely unaware that they were based off of this. Maybe this is a bit of a deep dive, but I used to watch Portal 2 fan songs. Man, I was a FNAF fan before FNAF existed back then, apparently. And little did I know, This Is Aperture is This Is Halloween. Who'd have thought? I certainly didn't. I thought those were original songs. And so it was mind-boggling when I finally got to see this movie, and then I somehow had all the notes ingrained into my head. Now, maybe it's because I had that exact experience and that visceral reaction to the soundtrack that I put it this high up on the list. But I think in general, stop motion really helps to emphasize the successes of a soundtrack, and this soundtrack and score should absolutely be accoladed because these movies are just brilliant. I've got to try and stop saying absolutely. I keep saying it. It's apparently my favorite standard go-to word. Even still, I half despair over the fact that I hadn't seen these movies sooner, but now that I finally have, oh, that's some good artwork and music to my ears. Literally. Oh. But okay. We've come to the real big hitters of the list now. We're coming to the real top end. This is where all of my biases come on full show, and I could inject all of these soundtracks directly into my veins. Going back to the classics, let's go to the eternally nostalgic Pixar standard that is the Toy Story soundtrack. Now, oddly enough, the first one's, it's okay. But for me, number 2 and even more number 3, fully must, I tried to stop saying absolutely there if you couldn't tell, has a brilliant sound font that's so recognizably Toy Story. And again, I think a lot of it is that interactive element of a soundtrack. With the Toy Story plot always being about tiny guys sneaking around, the soundtrack leads on that a lot, and I think it really embellishes the animation. Randy Newman, of course, is one of the best in the game. And it's to the point I don't even think there is a single bad song in this entire franchise. All the while, it manages to keep such a distinct sense of identity in there as well. There are a couple of lyrical songs in there, of course, especially the first Toy Story. They loved their little real-life, sort of pop cultural, lyrical song choices in there. But across the board, the soundtrack of this franchise is near and dear to my heart because it just feels not even necessarily cozy, because a lot of it's quite adventurous. It just feels right, man. And I think a lot of it, again, comes to that sense of whimsy that Pixar movies come with. Being a small little guy in a big obstacled world allows for that sense of optimism and triumph with every beat of the story. Whether it's the brass trumpets playing along as a character is running in place, or the slow strings whenever a success is made or an emotional moment is held, every single second of the sound of the Toy Story movies is unending gold. And it's to the point I reckon this will be the only saving grace of a 5th Toy Story movie. I think the soundtrack's gonna still be bloody brilliant. I don't know if there's a lot of nuance necessarily to the score. I mean, it's very much just the very first movie they ever made extended to just keep going. But something about it just strikes me at the core that I'm always in love with it. Being a wonderful blend of the Western elements when it needs to focus on Woody, some of the more sci-fi adventurous elements when focusing on Buzz, and then in general, really mastering a tone of tiny toys in a big world. It's a weird premise to try and tell songs around, but the movie nails it. What more can I say? I'm nostalgic for a movie that's older than I am. Lion King goes here, 2D. But sticking to that main theme, we have one of the last Pixar classics we're going to mention here, Finding Nemo. Going from Randy Newman to Thomas Newman, the Finding Nemo score is one of my favorite Pixar scores of all time. And I think it's weird because it's the fish movie of all things. But you know what it is? It's the beauty in this soundtrack. The movie doesn't necessarily have a strong environmental message to it, but it definitely tries to showcase the beauty of aquatic nature, if not just from the visuals having so much bloom and adoration for the underwater world. And with it, the soundtrack follows through. I do know I full-on fell asleep a few times as a kid to this movie, because I had to watch movies to fall asleep back then, I was fussy. And maybe that's the major point to this, but the soundtrack of Finding Nemo, more than any other movie, feels like a comfort soundtrack to me. Nothing feels more like warmth and joy and safety than the Finding Nemo score. And that's probably fitting considering the early parts of the movie are just a lot of plucks and plinks. And so much of the story is just Marlin going out through the ocean and discovering more beautiful landscapes of the aquatic world. Whilst at the same time, when it needs to get dramatic, it can definitely do that. When at the faster parts, it kind of sounds like a plucky kind of SimCity kind of soundtrack, which to be fair, also one of my favorite video game soundtracks of all time, SimCity 2013. So maybe there's something about the sound font and instruments used that just give me all the biases in the world. But what's also notable is this is very much a score of a movie. It's not that there's some mainline lyrical thing at the front pushing it into the next zeitgeist. I don't think I've heard people talk about the Finding Nemo soundtrack much because it is just the instrumental orchestra in the background of it. But for me, this is practically everything, and it's genuinely tough for me to put more movie soundtracks ahead of this one. At the very core of my being, somewhere deep down, is the home for where Finding Nemo rests within me. Or maybe it's because I have the core memory of being able to switch on the projector at the cinemas for Finding Nemo. Tactical way for me to dodge the traumatizing scene at the start, yeah. But enough about a niche score that I just happened to like as a kid. What is the most successful, coming back to it again, Disney mainline musical? I think it's obvious because it's not been mentioned yet. It is Moana. I adore the original Moana. The second one's long gone, not even on this list. That thing is buried. But Moana 1 fully nails on every direction what it means to be a good Disney musical. The lyrical songs are of course some of the best Disney's ever made. They in their own regard have gone viral and ascended from the medium it's in. Well, I don't know if you can really detach I Am Moana from Moana, but you certainly try. It's the most likable character out of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, which is quite a surprise to be able to do these days. And the score itself is good. Again, keeping the sound font very thematic to some of the Polynesian inspirations that built this movie. I don't think the score stands out that crazy much, but considering the success of the franchise as a whole and how good the mainline songs are, it's been bumped up to this high on the list. It would be blasphemous for me to not even include a Disney musical in the top 10s of this tier list, considering we're ranking animated movie soundtracks. Again, it's Lin-Manuel Miranda, they know what they're doing, and the franchise has been immortalized and sure to be milked all the more into terrible quality from here because of that fact. I don't think I can add any much more to that. I've spoken all sorts about Moana in the past, so let's just move on from here nice and quickly. Right into our very last honorable mention, it is 2D. It is the SpongeBob movie, the first one. Is it a coincidence that they're all 2004-ish adjacent? Probably not. Or soundtracks just got more homogenized, you know, they got more standard later on in life. That's the theory I'm going with, sure. But I mean, that movie is goated for a reason. Though you may remember some of the bigger, more lyrical stuff like I'm a Goofy Goober, Rock, Now That We're Men, and I'm Ready Depression if you're into the video games. But overall, this movie is such a masterpiece in every direction, and it bleeds into the soundtrack and the score as well. You might not particularly remember the score straight off the bat in your head, and to be fair, it sounds like a lot of the usual SpongeBob sound font, which in and of itself is iconic, unique, and certainly expressive. But need I remind you, beyond the sea shanties and the remake of the SpongeBob intro sequence from the series, there's also the moment when SpongeBob and Patrick are drying up, and it's not the musical number that sends them off, it's just a genuine dramatic orchestral piece. overly dramatic to be the biggest end to the SpongeBob story, sure, but it just goes to show that when the score needs to step up and sit on the same accolades as everything else this movie has achieved, it absolutely can. But hey, I'm going so far beyond this honorable mention, we've gone beyond 2D and into live action. That's absolutely not allowed on the channel. Let's move on. It's the final four. How to Train Your Dragon. Masterclass in so many directions. It doesn't need the lyrical song number in any form. This is pure, unadulterated, top-tier quality in your score. And it's not just because it sounds different in the sound font, just because it's got some Scottish influences like bagpipes integrated in all of its pieces. Even without all of that, this is just an orchestra nailing it for the massive achievements of the characters in its story. The soundtrack to this is some of the most motivating sense of the indomitable human spirit, perfectly fitting to the thematics of the characters in this story, pushing against the grain in a way with the biggest successes in doing so. There is no bigger feel-good score in any animated movie, and I don't even need to tell you the examples for you to know that, yeah, this kind of soundtrack deserves to be a top-tier soundtrack. Whilst at the same time, of course, it's a DreamWorks trilogy soundtrack, so they fully nail all the other directions and goals for a soundtrack to achieve. The slower, emotive elements of this movie wouldn't be as successful without the slower, more emotive successes of the score in these scenes too. How to Train Your Dragon is easily one of the best DreamWorks movies of all time, and it seems so many of the successes of general animated movies do bleed into the score and the soundtrack too. While Kung Fu Panda does a great job of adapting more Chinese influences in a way that perhaps the Western world wouldn't be so familiar with, I certainly wasn't in the days of Kung Fu Panda, How to Train Your Dragon manages to do that exact same thing that's a little bit more closer to home, coming from the same sources as the island I'm from. And in doing so, comes across, even to people that aren't necessarily from the UK and Scotland, as one of the greatest examples of an animated movie score of all time. And despite having no real lyrics to bounce off of to really hit that viral moment, How to Train Your Dragon has several examples of its score that have managed to ascend this movie and get used as some of the most motivating orchestral pieces. By all regards, this is meant to be the kind of standard score of orchestra, drama, no words. But it is easily one of the best examples against all of the rest of the bunch, with both a little bit of that extra twang of uniqueness and then otherwise just pure spirit, the likes of which I don't think any other movie on this list really trounces. And so up next on our list, honestly it's a push that all of these could be number one, but the next one on our list is of course Pixar's The Incredibles. Oh, just listen to it. Now this is a very interesting sound font that they went for with the score. Absolutely no lyrical stuff really in this, unless you count Mr. Incredible Pow 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 from the sequel. Because this is a spy movie. Even though it's clearly superheroes, it's Fantastic Four, it's, a 2004 version that's before the MCU, with it being baked into the decade of the 1960s, it's very much more tying onto the James Bond tropes with this unapologetically jazzy, brassy soundtrack that is so very iconic. And again, all sorts of interactive. Spies mean you're sneaking around, and you get that sense with so many of the dramatic pieces of this soundtrack. Do I need to remind you of half of the examples? 100 Mile Dash? Mr. Incredible's feeling incredible again? The Ink credits? Brilliant name, by the way. This soundtrack just has all of the benefits for being at the top of this list. It's early 2000s nostalgic for me. It sounds massively unique from the standards of animated movies. It's interactive with the actions on screen, and it's all about the score, baby. It's not about the lyrical stuff. Whilst also at the same time, it can express into the more emotional and soft. But when it wants to get big and loud, it can certainly do that too. This is the soundtrack that can achieve everything as far as I'm concerned, being a perfect homage to a genre of music that already exists, and arguably excelling to beyond the accolades of the genre. The Incredibles overall, just like the SpongeBob movie, is just a masterpiece in every direction, so of course that bleeds into the qualities of the soundtrack as well. Not so much going for the early Pixar's whimsy, but it does go for that mystery tone, and the congratulatory successes of a good action set piece. And in keeping some of the music choices so simple, like a little drum beat that gets faster and faster as rockets are appearing outside of a jet, it's just so brilliant. You don't need to go any further than that. It's just brass and a slowly crescendoing tempo of drama. It's so loud and it's so in your face in the ways that the old movies does, that it's so unique to the usual standard stuff you'd hear around 2004 and 20 years later when scores all sound relatively similar to each other. Again, I see it as the only silver lining in the clouds of so many Pixar sequels coming out. You get to hear more gold like this for your ears. And in that regard, I am so fully on board for The Incredibles 3, just so I can download the soundtrack and play it on loop. But what can beat my deep childhood nostalgia for one of the best Pixar movies in existence? It's Sony, of all people. Sony and Into the Spider-Verse. And Across, why not? That too. What do you know? The most masterful soundtracks come from the most masterful cinema as well. Spider-Verse is unique in the sense that it is such a strange, multiversal story, one of the first and one of the best. And in the soundtrack, it works all the more too. Because it's not just the standard soundtrack to a Marvel kind of story, it's both thematic to the multiple characters in the story and changing all to their different styles, but also it's remixed by a real DJ handling it in real time. No other movie sounds like Spider-Verse does. And though there are obviously the big ones up top, the big notable score stuff that you'll probably remember, like Swinging Through New York, or of course the pop cultural moment like What's Up Danger being up front and center, but there's loads of small versions that are probably still in there in your head. You know how it sounds, you just might not focus on it that much. Like the usual comic book segments that have a slow rising crescendo through them. Much like The Incredibles, Spider-Verse nails the audio for every single scene, and for a story that is so unique and blasé and interesting, add on the fact that it's got the viral lyrical stuff and a unique approach into the score, and as well as all sorts of interactive elements to there as well. Spider-Verse stands as a masterclass in filmmaking and a masterclass in score making as well. Is that the right term? Whatever, composing, that's probably the better word for that. All the while looping it back to some of the core themes that anyone can be Spider-Man. It's not just a movie that sounds good for the characters within it, it's a soundtrack that stays with you and sounds so empowering that it sounds like it's reaching to you to reach your highest goals. I don't know if a soundtrack like Spider-Verse could ever be beaten. It is easily one of the best animated cinema soundtracks of all time, and it'll probably stay like that for a long time, even against the likes of their sequels, whether they're gonna finish that or not. And finally, we have Shrek. What a weird, chaotic movie to breach through all of the accolades for what it basically is. But yeah, the soundtrack is a masterclass. It's a lot of pop culture moments, but in its own sense became so iconic and intrinsically attached to the band that it used to represent some of its beats. But even beyond the massively viral main lyrical stuff on the external side of things, you've then also got the actual score itself, which you might think you don't remember it, but you definitely do, because it's so good. It became not just the motif for this iconic subversive character, it became the theme for the entire animation studio itself. The Shrek theme is the DreamWorks logo theme, and it is genuinely magical. One of the best fairy tale stories, and it's making fun of fairy tale stories. And there's loads of examples of brilliant pieces of score. I love, personally, from Shrek 2, The Ball. A big, brassy, Shrekified version of your classic reality TV show montage for, like, the Oscars, essentially. There's so many great references and ideas showcased in this score for being both legitimate fairy tale emotive storytelling and great big nonsense parody as well. It's hard to believe that a movie that is so clearly just about giving the middle finger can be so successful in all directions, but it genuinely really is. There are no bigger viral hits for a movie soundtrack than the viral stuff from Shrek, and these are the most emotive and expressive versions of telling both a dramatic story and a big fun parody piece as well. In all directions, Shrek is brilliant. It might not have the DJ remixing of Spider-Verse or the spy thriller genre like The Incredibles, but for everything Shrek is trying to achieve, it is beyond a 10 out of 10 and could easily mix into any of the places for these top 4 or 5 slots. Whether it's Smash Mouth loudly playing some sort of keytar in your face, simply a single singer giving a vocal choir performance for the transformation of Fiona at the first movie, or heck, Jennifer Saunders, main cast member, chucked into doing a pop culture song, but doing it so well that it actually ascends the original version itself. I know this is the kind of thing I said we're putting at the very bottom of the list, like Trolls and Sing, but this is how you do it right. It's non-invasive, in fact, it's very baked into the character and the parodious themings in that it's making fun of the reality show nature of a Hollywood-strucken fairy tale city. And so in that context, it doesn't take away the immersion of the Shrek story and only acts to embellish the strange reality that these specific characters play off of. The Trolls aren't giving us a theme about reality TV or celebrity culture as a whole, they just are celebrities, and they sing their celebrity pop culture songs. Always upon the surface level, when I put Shrek up on a list like this, I feel like it's going to be a big upset nonsense point, but the moment I think about it more, the more it really cements its place as easily one of the best animated movie soundtracks of all time. Crazy, because it's bloody well Shrek. And on that surprising note, it's surprising to me at least, that is our top tier list of animated movie soundtracks. I don't know how controversial all those takes are. There are certain soundtracks that I certainly roll my eye at more than the average person, and at the same time, I can acknowledge the fact I've got a lot of childhood biases. It's what makes it my list at the end of the day. But I think overall, I'm relatively happy with how this list came out, and though I could have easily expanded into all the more 2D representations, I mean, I didn't well bloody mention Brother Bear, one of my favorites of all time. I think it's a good idea considering I've already been speaking for an hour and 50 minutes, so I should probably hold off there before going way too deep down the rabbit hole of other 2D movies. Disney alone would kill me on the runtime. I know my tier lists can oftentimes be a little bit grating to some people, a big surprise on what I actually like and dislike. We all have strange opinions on something, I'm sure. So let me know, where exactly would you put certain soundtrack picks in your list? Is there a big movie I forgot in this list? It's possible, and if I did, I apologize. I mean, I half forgot Lego Movie until halfway through this recording, but yeesh, oh well. Anyway, on that note, I should probably finally end things off there. My name's been Daz, thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Let me know your thoughts down below or on our Discord server, and I shall see you all in a little bit. Bye-bye!